Welcome to the Midnight Society. We're going to be reading some true ghost stories from the Little Giant Book of True Ghost Stories. Let's go to it. The Ghost Who Hated Women. Sounds like a Redditor. They say he was a terrible man when he was alive, full of anger and hate. He hasn't improved since he became a ghost. They call him George, and he inhabits a bedroom on the third floor of the old stone house, a little museum in Georgetown, a section of Washington, D.C. The house is reputed to be the oldest building in Washington. It certainly seems to be one of the most haunted. The most violent ghost in the place is called George. He hates women. The old stone house in a national museum administered by the National Park Service. Ray Coach, the park ranger in charge, said that one time George tried to push her over a railing outside his third floor bedroom. She managed to resist him and lived to tell the tale. Often, Ray says, when women try to go into George's room, they can't get out. Something seems to be holding them out. Guess who? George seems to take a particular dislike to Evelyn, a teenage English girl who worked as a volunteer at the house, Ray says. When Evelyn would go into that bedroom, you could actually see her being pushed out. There was something about Evelyn that seemed to set George off, and if you were Evelyn, his anger might spill over on you. One time, another member of the staff, Karen Cobb, went up to the third floor with Evelyn. Evelyn began to feel very uncomfortable, as well she might, and left the room. Perhaps George was frustrated that Evelyn had gotten away. When Evelyn left, Karen said later, "The next thing I knew, there were hands around my neck, strangling me. I managed to break loose and ran down the stairs. I ran outside. It was like it was pursuing me till I got out into the courtyard. I just collapsed on the bricks. My throat was badly bruised. I've gone up there since, but believe me, not with Evelyn. Various visitors have seen George. One woman visitor asked, 'Who is that man on the third floor with the suspenders?' A staff volunteered. Peggy Beach had ancestors who lived in the house before it became a museum. She thinks George is a great-great-grandfather of hers. He often wore suspenders. He was an awful man," she says. George Costanza. The next one is The Tale of the Evil in Room 310. Marcia Bennett told me the story herself. She had been north to visit friends in the state of Washington. Now she was driving back to her home in California. The last lap of the day's journey was over the Cascade Range that stretches from Washington to California. It was late evening, and snow had begun to fall before she finally reached the little Oregon town where she planned to spend the night. Tired and ready for a hot meal and a good night's sleep, she stopped at the first place she came upon. It was an old hotel on the main street. The lobby had a musty odor. The seedy clerk behind the desk signed her in. Her room was on the third floor, room 310. An elderly bellhop helped her with her luggage. As soon as the door was opened, a blast of hot air struck Marcia full in the face. With the hot air came something else, something she could not define, but that filled her with dread. It was heavy and depressing, she explained, with a strong scent of evil. She felt as if she was about to faint. All she said was, "It's awfully hot." The bellhop tinkered with the radiator knobs. Then he opened the window and left. The room began to cool off, but feeling of despair and dread grew stronger. It centered on the open square of black window space. The terror seemed to speak to her mind. "Go to the window," it said. "Throw yourself out! Out! Out!" Terrified, Marcia flung herself on the bed farthest from the window. I kept saying, "No, no, no," to that voice, she told me, but the voice kept insisting. "You can't fight me, you puny thing," it said. "Sooner or later, you'll jump. I'll make you jump, jump, jump." At last, Marcia could stand it no longer. She jumped up, calling herself a coward. "Coward or not," she explained, "I was sure that if I stayed the night, I'd be dead by the morning." Marcia was prepared to sacrifice the money she already paid just to leave, but when she went downstairs with her baggage to check out, the clerk never asked what was wrong or if she wished to try another room. He returned the full cash amount to her. Marcia drove down to the street to a modern hotel. As she entered the lobby, she felt the dark, depressing slip from her shoulders. She became almost giddy with relief. She had planned to be on her way early the next morning. Instead, she decided to stay over a day and look into the history of the old hotel to see if she could discover the reason for her terrifying experience there. She visited the local library to make a few inquiries. An elderly librarian sat behind the desk. "I'm just wondering," Marcia said tentatively, "did anything shocking ever happen in the old hotel?" The librarian looked at her strangely. "How did you come upon that bit of history?" she asked. It took the hotel a long time to squash that story. The librarian went on to tell what had happened. One evening back in 1948, a couple checked into the hotel as Mr. and Mrs. Oscar Smith. The next morning, hotel employees found the young woman's body lying on the sidewalk outside the hotel beneath room 310. The man who had registered as her husband had disappeared. At first, it was ruled suicide, the librarian concluded. But then they pried open her fist and found it clutched a handful of dark curly hair, not her own. So they made a search for the murderer, but he was never found. "By the way," the librarian suddenly asked, "isn't that a coincidence? It all happened on November 5th, 40 years ago, yesterday." That's creepy. Okay, now the next one is The Tale of A Deadly Game of Cat and Mouse. At 6:30 on the evening of April 1st, 1959, a big four-engine C-118 transport aircraft of the USAF's 175th Air Transport Wing roared down the main runway of McChord Air Force Base near Tacoma, Washington, and climbed into the southern sky for the four men on board. This was a routine training mission, so routine that it was virtually automatic. At 7:45 p.m., the staff in the control tower at McChord Air Force Base heard a frantic distress call from the C-118's pilot. "Mayday, mayday, we've had something, or something has hit us. I am returning to base." Then, a few seconds later, came a final desperate scream. "This is it! This is it!" And then there was only silence. The C-118 had crashed into the side of the mountain in the Cascade Range, 30 miles northwest of Mount Rainier's 14,400-foot peak. Air Force crash crews and armed guards raced to the scene. Newsmen and others who attempted to get close were warned off at gunpoint. Explanations and rumors spread like wildfire. Had the aircraft been testing some new device? That was unlikely since the C-118 was only a freighter. Could pilot error be the answer? Or perhaps the C-118 had run into the flock of birds or collided with another plane? Then why the secrecy? But the Air Force knew that none of these reasons was the real one, because a few minutes before the pilot's distress call, the powerful radar at McChord Air Force Base had revealed that the C-118 had picked up 3 or 4 mysterious traveling companions, strange luminous specks of light that darted around the big transport. Gradually, the Air Force specialists who were investigating the crash had built up a minute-by-minute picture of the strange and terrifying fate of the large aircraft. At 7 o'clock on that April evening, residents in the area between Seattle and Mount Rainier had been alarmed by a series of explosions. Mysterious detonations that seemed to come from a clear sky. 20 minutes later, the whole region was shaken by an even bigger bang. About the same time, several bright, luminous objects were seen racing across the sky. They traveled at incredible speeds and in complete silence. Many other people witnessed strange flashes and glows around the horizon. Eyewitnesses in Orting, not far from the scene of the crash, told investigators that the C-118 had appeared overhead at about 7:45 p.m. All the aircraft's four engines had stopped, and a large chunk of its tail was missing. And strangest of all, the C-118 was being followed by a formation of three shining discs. Every now and then, one of them would break away and dart towards the transport, skipping over or veering off to one side at the last moment. It was just as though the C-118 were being hounded by a pack of vicious dogs. Several people in the Orting area watched the aircraft and its unearthly companions until they were out of sight. A minute later, two bright flashes ripped the sky to the northeast. It was at that precise moment that the radio transmission from the C-118 ceased abruptly with the pilot's frantic, "This is it!" The first rescue team to arrive at the scene of the crash found a nightmare of charred, twisted metal fragments, hardly any of them more than a foot across, scattered over a whole mountainside. They found three mangled, dislocated bodies, two sunk deep in the ground by the fearful impact. The fourth body was never found. There was no sign of the pilot's tail fin and rudder. They were found much later, miles away in the hill, to the north of the North Rainier. From the wilderness of torn wreckage, the accident investigators were able to reconstruct exactly how the C-118 had hit the ground. And they came up with a number of facts that baffled them completely. For a start, they calculated that even if the aircraft had nosedived into the ground under full power, the impact would not have been great enough to rip the machine into such a wildly scattered sea of small fragments. But the C-118 had not plowed into the earth nose first. It had struck on its belly, as though a giant hand had slammed it out of the air with incredible force, just as a person swats a fly. What happened in those last fateful minutes before the C-118's plunge to the earth? It is beyond the realm of possibility that the aircraft was used as the object of a deadly game of cat and mouse by alien craft, a game that ended in disaster when they, whoever or whatever they were, tired of what might have seemed a cumbersome toy and slapped it casually out of the sky. Now for the final story. This is a tale of You Will Die at Midnight. Sounds romantic. Probably the most amazing case ever recorded of a death premonition concerned Thomas Lord Lyttelton. The remarkable events took place in November 1779. Lyttelton had gone from London to his country house in Epsom, where he was convalescing after an illness. Walking in a large conservatory with Lady Affleck and her two daughters, Lyttelton noticed a robin perched on an orange tree close by. He tried to catch it, but failed. Seeing the ladies exchange amused glances, he vowed he would catch it, even if it killed him. After a long chase, he succeeded. The next morning, Lyttelton appeared at the breakfast table, so pale and haggard that his guests anxiously asked him if anything was the matter. Finally, he told them a strange story. The previous night, after he had lain awake for some time, he heard what sounded like the tapping of a bird at his window, followed by a gentle fluttering of wings in his room. Puzzled, he raised himself on an elbow and saw an amazing sight. In the center of the room stood a beautiful woman dressed in white, with a small robin perched like a falcon on her wrist. This woman told him to prepare for death as he had only a short time to live. When Lyttleton was able to speak, he asked how long he had. The phantom replied, "Not 3 days, and you will depart at the hour of 12." For 2 days, Lyttleton fluctuated between despondency, hysterical gaiety. At dinner on Saturday, the third day, he amazed his guests with his wit and vitality, but afterwards he lapsed into a gloomy silence, and as the evening wore on, he grew restless. He could not sit still, but paced restlessly to and fro, muttering incoherently. Every few minutes he took out his pocket watch, gazed at the time, and wiped beads of sweat from his forehead. Eventually, when the hands of his watch read 11:30, he went to his room without a word of farewell to his guest. He had no idea that not only his own watch, but every clock in the house had been put forward half an hour by well-meaning friends. Sitting up in his bed, watch in hand, Lyttleton awaited the fatal hour of midnight. As the minute hand slowly approached 12, he asked to see his valet watch and found that it showed the same time as his own. With pounding heart and straining eyes, he watched the minute hand draw nearer and nearer to midnight. A minute to go, half a minute. Then it pointed to the fatal hour, and nothing happened. It crept slowly past. The crisis was over. Lyttleton put down the watch with a sigh of relief, then broke into wild, hysterical giggling. He spoke to his valet for 10 minutes more and seemed to be his normal self once again, completely at ease. Then he returned his nightly dose of medicine and asked his valet to prepare it. As no spoon was at hand, the valet stirred it with the handle of a toothbrush that lay on the bedside table. Lyttleton scolded him for his dirty habits and ordered him to fetch a proper spoon. When the servant returned a few minutes later, Lyttleton was lying back on his pillow, breathing heavily, and with a strange, haunted look in his eyes. The valet ran downstairs to get help. The alarmed guest rushed to his room, but a few moments later, he was dead. The watch clutched in his hand, pointing to 12:30. In reality, he had died on the very stroke of midnight. Scary tales. Don't let the bed bugs bite, and bad dreams. Goodbye.